I'm Aubrey Sitterson, and this is SKALD. You're listening to the only story that matters. This is true oral storytelling. I write every episode myself, and then, like the Scandinavian bards known as skalds, I perform each of them in one single, flawless take. SKALD is serialized, but every episode is a great jumping on point. After listening, if you want some backstory, check out the previous episodes of the podcast or pick up the prose volumes on Amazon. This isn't me reading you a story. This is me telling you a story. This is SKALD, part 64. An eldritch star. Woad blue emblazoned on scarred flesh. A pulsing rune. A spinning sigil, its arms twisting and turning in every direction. And none at all. And as those arms reached out, as they lashed out, as they worked themselves into a heaving fit, shifting and quivering underneath that blasted skin, weathered by a lifetime of exposure, a lifetime of suffering, as those 8 chaotic arms lashed out. So too did the arms of the one true King of men, of the one true King of flames and ashes, of King Maul. He roared as he charged ahead, leaping over the fallen form at his feet, leaping over his niece, his very flesh and blood, leaping over her blood as it leaked from a crushing wound in the back of her head, the one left by a kiss, left by the bite that came with every swing of Maul's dread hammer. And now he clutched it in both of his steady hands, and he swung it in a wide arc, letting out a horrible scream, a war cry, one that was drowned out by a sound even more horrible, a grisly harmony comprised of the crunch of bone, the sick thud of viscera, and a gurgled cry for mercy that would not come. Because Maul charged ahead as he always did, because going back, because retreat, because submission was not an option, was never an option. He charged ahead at his next target, his next victim, the imbecile king of the High Elves, Roland. The fool. He had placed himself between Maul and his queen. That fool had, foolishly, thought himself fit, thought himself able, thought himself capable of standing against the unrelenting assault of one such as Maul, one who had suffered endlessly, had been broken repeatedly, and yet still stood, still charged ahead, still attacked and sought out the blood that his vengeance required. And Maul got what he wanted. As so rarely happened, Maul got exactly what he wanted, got exactly what he deserved, what was rightfully his. He got Roland's blood, the very life force of that imbecile king, the one who had the audacity, the temerity, the brazen gall to wed her, to wed Enlith, to marry Maul's fated rival, to marry Maul's fated lover, the one who had spurned him and forsaken him, the one whom he had spared and in doing so had lost everything, the one who cost him everything twice over, Queen Enlith. No. One such as this, one such as him, deserved no mercy, deserved no quarter. So Maul gave none. He gave nothing, nothing but a simple, artless, disdainful strike, not caring enough for that doomed soul to even gift him with a noble death. No, instead, Maul, screaming, swung his hammer carelessly, sailing over Roland's gilded shield, flying by his ornately crafted sword, one more accustomed to touching shoulders and removing heads from them. The blow connected with a sickening crack, the noise of Roland's neck snapping, a noise that soon gave way to the gruesome symphony of Roland's impending death. The king of the High Elves crumpled to the ground, gurgling and gasping, his eyes grown wide with fear, grown wide when confronted with that inky black void of nothingness. Is this it? Is this who you chose instead of me? Maul growled, a sadistic sneer contorting his already fearsome visage as he casually raised his hammer once again, bringing it down in a thunderous crash, an explosive climax to Roland's short, sad, final song. He was a poor replacement. Enlith swung her sword slowly, easing into the battle stance she had practiced since childhood. And then she cast off her helm, the better to see Maul, to see her rival, to see the man who had murdered her family, who had taken everything from her, to see his eyes, to see the surprise that filled them as she put him down like the wild, feral beast that he was. No, he was a fine replacement. She grinned and advanced, because at least he had the good sense to die once he was no longer useful. Maul, in his arrogance, wasn't ready for Enlith's attack. Because though Maul was a threat many times over, though he boasted primal fury, royal strength, an unquenchable thirst for revenge, a thirst for blood, though he had been through worse, though he had done worse, though he, most importantly, possessed a sense of mad desperation that made him more dangerous than any cornered beast, though Maul was formidable indeed, his tactics, where they even existed, were simple, crude, and mean. So when Enlith lunged forward, her gleaming, singing sword, the pride of the duelsmiths leading the way, he knew no other method of rebuffing the attack. He knew no way to counter except through the thing that had carried him thus far. Brute, unyielding force. He swung his hammer with both hands once again, smashing it against that ringing steel, knocking Enlith's sword off of its deadly path. But Maul's blow could not knock Enlith's sword from her hand. Though Maul stood tall, proud, and firmly rooted, like the mighty ash that had been his prison, like the mighty ash that now rose up behind him, assaulted by Enlith's tireless dwarves. Though Maul was a tree, stern and steadfast, his opponent, his love, the object of his affection and his rage, Enlith was a sapling. flexible and lithe, able to withstand winds that would topple her opponent in a breath. She reacted instantaneously. She twisted her supple wrist, she redirected her assault, and she sent her sword soaring back toward its hulking target. And her target? Maul wasn't ready. He wasn't prepared, because his massive haymaker swing, a swing that could have felled a god, had left him unable to parry, unable to counter or riposte, and he could do nothing but twist away in craven avoidance as the singing sword bit into his shoulder. Maul spat as he backed away, circling around Enlith. Elven tricks. Keep at it. Keep at it. Eventually you'll tire and your dance will slow and I will be waiting. Enlith, emboldened at the sight of her enemy, at the sight of her rival's blood, began to laugh. No. I don't think this'll take that long. She glanced momentarily over her shoulder, shouting out commands to her dwarves, the ones who stared dumbfounded at the wanton carnage unfolding all around them. Keep working! If the tree isn't uprooted, if it isn't scoured from the earth, this brute's death won't even matter. It won't even... As Enlith turned back around, as she refocused on the battlefield, she was confronted by that very brute. Maul charged ahead, once again, no longer screaming, because his jaw was set. His teeth were clenched, his brows lowered, his eyes on fire, the wicked sigils upon his skin glowing and moaning in ecstasy. He charged ahead, wielding his hammer with one hand, the better to nurse his wounded shoulder, protecting it from further damage as he punished Enlith for her arrogance, as he punished her for her condescension and her dismissal, as he punished her for her betrayal, as he beat her into the dirt of that forsaken border realm. But what Maul saw as arrogance in his opponent was actually well-founded confidence. Because even charging silently, Enlith had more than enough time to sidestep the attack, to artfully dodge the heavy, unwieldy hammer plummeting down toward her. But as she did so, as she hopped aside, she learned a costly lesson. She learned that as savage as he was, as brutal and crude as his methods were, there was still a primal elegance in Maul's thinking. There was still a feral cleverness, one that as his volley missed its target, urged him to turn that initial attack into a feint, to use it as a smokescreen, to hide the real attack, to hide what he produced from his tattered rags, that terrifying weapon, the one that seemed to cut through the light itself as he slashed it through the air, cutting a long, jagged scar across Enlith's formerly stoic, formerly flawless visage. Enlith howled, and she put a hand to her face, an effort to staunch the flowing blood that now threatened to pour into her eyes, blinding her to the still ongoing battle. She backed away quickly, but carefully, swinging her sword in front of her in quick, erratic arcs, an effort to keep the rampaging beast, the one who had now blooded her, to keep Maul at bay. And when she removed her hand, when she gazed out upon her rival, when she looked through a sheen of crimson gore to find what had so wounded her, what had struck not just her face, but something at the core of her being. She saw it, saw her blood gleaming on its tip, staining that pure white glow. She saw that terrible weapon, the object of the Pharaoh's foolish quests, the very thing they hoped to use to defeat her, to topple her kingdom. She saw that long, twisting alabaster horn. I'm smarter than I look, Maul growled, his countenance darkening with resentment, with hate. Hate for Enlith, for the world that had damned him. Hate for him, and not least of all, hate for himself. I'm smarter than you realize. I'm better than you can imagine. More dangerous than you know, but you'll learn. You'll learn. Maul, leading with that long, twisting alabaster horn, wielding his hammer in his other hand, ready to lash out, ready to deliver the coup de grace, he stalked forward, a rictus grin spreading across his face. You look like an animal. Like a bad dog left to its worst instincts, like a mangy beast taken by rabies. Enlith, sneering through the crimson mask she now wore, reached down to her thigh, unsheathing a long, curved dagger, one she held overhand, pairing it with her sword in the style that she had learned as a child, the style that she and Maul had learned together as children in the elf realm, the style that the brute now imitated, mocked, and degraded with a beast's horn and a makeshift hammer. Now it's time for me to do what I should have done years ago, what my father should have done years ago before me. She began to run at Maul, her feet barely touching the ground as she picked up speed. It's time for me to put you down. They rushed, panicked, through the city. Exhausted, their considerable powers expended, their impressive strength stretched beyond the breaking point, Henno and his brother Patro struggled to keep up with his protege, with the sorceress, Caleria. Though she had finished their battle, though she and that horrible spear, that gleaming black fell weapon, though she had saved not only herself, but Henno and Patro and the entire city of Ravenna by vanquishing that titan impossibly in a single blow. She did not tire. No. If anything, calling up that hungry flame, calling up that cathartic blaze. It had invigorated her. It ignited her soul and filled her heart with desire. Desire to save the city, to save it from the threats from without and those from within, to save Ravenna from its very inhabitants, the ones that tore through the streets screaming and howling, tearing their clothes from their bodies, revealing flesh that turned green. Even as Caleria gazed upon it, she knew only one way to save the city, only one way to cleanse The city. She knew only one way to dispatch with that savage brute, with the one who had destroyed her meager, miserable home, the only home she had ever known, the one who had murdered the monk Xylan, the only love that she had ever known. She knew one way, and one way only, to solve all of her problems. And the spear in her hands shook and twisted in knowing response. Calaria's entire body shook with excitement, with power, her very being vibrating to dangerous, chaotic rhythms, patterns that did not go unnoticed by Henno and Patro. So between stolen breaths, in between heaving coughs, amidst their struggle to simply breathe, as they rocketed through ravenous streets, as they headed to where Maul and Rashka meant to confront the High Elves, Henno and Patro urged restraint. Henno, he struggled to remind her of the magics he had imparted to her, the secrets he had bestowed upon her, the simple truth that there is more to gain from turning her enemies, from twisting their desires, from tricking them into working for her, to realizing her will, all as if it was what they themselves desired. And meanwhile, Patro, in between gasps, fought to point out the possibilities that the savage Maul held within him. Through magic, through clever application, through redirecting Maul's considerable hate, power, and potential, he had accomplished the impossible. He had freed the Titan. He had begun unraveling his brother's magics, and he had stormed the Citadel, the center of those crumbling sigils. As they fought through the teeming crowds, the slavering masses of green-skinned monstrosities, their bodies spasming as they transformed unwillingly into a version of themselves they had always nurtured, as Henno and Patro urged, pleaded, commanded, and begged, Calaria simply ran, flames growing in her eyes as her face gave itself over to a twisted, familiar, rictus grin. As she rounded a corner, as she turned to face the city square, the one where Maul and his army of grotesque statues had begun their invasion, the one where that massive ash tree now strained to hold up the heavens above, as she came around the corner, clutching that blackened spear with white knuckles, the veins of red in its stone head pulsing with the rhythm of her pounding heart, she stopped suddenly. She saw her rival, her enemy, the man who had taken everything she had known from her, as she saw Maul at his most savage and his most fierce. Covered in blood, covered in a thick, sanguine horror that was still not thick enough to obscure those terrible blue tattoos, Maul stood hulking, panting, and howling pained, enraged gibberish. He looked as if he had more blood outside his skin than in. It failed to slow him down. It failed to bother him at all as he prowled in a wide circle around a furious, scowling woman, one whose regal nature seemed to cover the entire square in a glowing yellow light, illuminating the broken statues, the dead bodies, and the dwarves that still worked diligently at the ash tree, assaulting it with axe, with saw, with shovel, with rope, and with flame. Hilaria watched in disgust, watched in barely contained horror as Maul howled unintelligible obscenities at the woman who stood before him, and in response, she hurled indecipherable invective back at him, brandishing her sword wildly. Hilaria watched as the pair clashed again and again, Enlith shrugging off Maul's volleys, and Maul simply ignoring her attacks. She watched as they wounded one another and themselves, watched as their insatiable deathlust spat and hissed, driving them both, driving the city of Ravenna itself closer and closer to that inky black void of nothingness. Hilaria watched as the green-skinned hordes began to come into their own, as they began to realize their true nature, as they gave in to the bestial urges that animated them. She watched as Henno and Patro, exhausted, coughed their fetid whispers into her ear as they urged her again and again to spare Maul, to condemn him to slavery, willing or unwilling, to use him for her benefit, for the city's benefit, for the greater good. As they spoke, Maul, tired of screaming, tired of fighting, ready to finish it, ready to finish what had begun when he was but an infant stolen from his world, denied his birthright. He threw back his head and let loose a roar that caused the already shaking buildings around him to crumble. He cried out to anything, good or evil, old or new, anything, anyone that could help him, that could give him the vengeance he craved, the revenge he deserved, and send him on his way to the realm of men, to his home. He let out that savage, plaintive cry, the howl of a wolf with no pack. And then he lowered his head, and for the last time, he charged at the Queen of the Elves. Enlith had been trained in swordplay since the day she could walk. She knew how to counter any attack, how to lure and trick her opponents, how to turn their strengths against them, and most importantly, she knew how to exhibit patience, how to wait for that perfect, inimitable, exquisite moment, the opening that would allow her to deliver not a flurry of blows, but the single strike that could bring a heated battle to its end. As that savage brute, as that vicious oaf rushed toward her, she had no opportunity to put her considerable knowledge to use. Because Maul wasn't attacking. Maul was charging. Unable to murder Enlith with his crude weapons and cruder use of them, Maul meant to stampede her, to bowl her over and grind her into the earth. There was no stopping him. He was too big, too strong, too fast, and too angry. She couldn't stop him. with skill, with knowledge, with speed. She could kill him. In an instant, she had dropped her dagger. She had taken up her longsword with both hands. She had braced her feet in a wide stance, and she, shockingly, leaned in to Maul's charge, allowing Maul's very movement to impale him upon her gleaming, singing sword. To Caleria's eyes, it seemed a horrific blow, a mortal one if not tended to immediately. But Maul, unconcerned with what came next, unconcerned with the future or anything it held, Maul cared only for the moment, only for the instant, so he didn't stop his charge. He continued forward, barreling into Enlith and knocking her to the ground, her unbreakable sword snapping off at the hilt, its razor-sharp blade still embedded in Maul's torso. Madness taking his eyes, with his Woad blue tattoos crawling frantically all over his body, Maul raised his hammer high above his head and once again let loose a stomach-churning howl, a cry belted out at a frequency that shook the lungs of all those present, causing them to cough and wheeze in response. As he did, twins, haltingly, spoke to Caleria once again. Caleria, you have to act now. Patro pleaded with her. You have to do something. Spare this world the fate that befell your own. Henno, tears in his eyes, begged his protege. Caleria, watching Maul with his hammer, that gnarled, blackened, notched, and bloodied cudgel with that grotesque stone head atop it, as she watched him raise his weapon, she raised her own. That gleaming, black, fell spear. Yes, you're right. And as those ancient wizards looked on, aghast, she raised the spear and pointed it at Maul, as her eyes rolled back into her head and she gave herself over to the only one who had ever helped her, who had ever saved her, gave herself over to him and offered him that which he always welcomed. A sacrifice. You! She cried out with a voice that was not her own. You shall learn your place. You shall learn your purpose if it takes you all of eternity. Though he had been taken by madness, Maul was not so far gone to ignore everything around him, was not so far gone that he didn't recognize the terrible voice that called out to him, didn't recognize the sorceress standing before him or the spear she pointed directly at him. But before he could rise, before he could do anything to address this new threat, a threat that he had dealt with time after time, a threat that would continue to haunt him for as long as he drew breath, Maul's attention was drawn by a noise. By a pair of noises. By a cracking and a mewling. He turned, shocked, shaken to his very core, turned to see the source of that noise, a noise he hadn't heard since he was a child, running through the primeval forests of the elf realm. He turned to the tree, to where the dwarves worked feverishly to uproot it, to where they, with their axes and their saws, had split open one of the largest roots, one of those riotous tendrils that burst up triumphantly out of the ground, and there, inside the root, inside the tree itself, crawling up out of it, clawing its way out of that mighty ash, was a cub. A mewling kitten, the sight of which calmed Maul's furies, smoothing the violent waters of his shattered mind. And as the hate drained from him, as his insatiable death lust gave way to something else, gave way to compassion, to concern, to joy, and to relief, Maul, tears welling up in his eyes, opened his mouth and spoke in a tired, trembling voice, one that he had locked away since childhood. Skog. But as the cub mewled its response, the breath was sucked out of Maul's lungs. The very oxygen around him ignited in licking fire. Calaria's prayer had been answered. He had heeded her call. He had accepted her sacrifice, and he did it gladly. He did it with glee as Maul, while abandoning his vengeance, while forsaking his fury, while reaching out to his companion, to the only one he had ever loved and been loved by in return, as Maul was immolated, was wreathed in an unholy conflagration, in a ravenous, cathartic blaze, was consumed by a ravaging inferno. Maul, the one true king of men, burst into flames, and when they abated, there was naught but ashes. SKALD is completely DIY. I've got no advertising or marketing budget. That means that if I want the show's audience to grow, and I definitely do, I need positive word of mouth. And one of the best ways to get it? Reviews on iTunes, Amazon, Google Play, and Stitcher. My old pal Charlemagnum P.I. says, imaginatively brutal, brutally imaginative. SKALD is a fireside tale told by the shifting light of 3 moons. SKALD is the dream of a dust-caked caravan driver asleep on bales of mammoth wool, packed on his solar-powered motor dray. SKALD is a story on the verge of being forgotten, recapitulated in the shared mind space of a dying brain collective in a buried library. SKALD is a triumph. Back in the old days, SKALDs couldn't ply their trade on their own. No, they needed people who would support their artistic endeavors, people who made it possible for them to do what they did best. They needed patrons. And now you can become a patron of the only story that matters by heading to patreon.com/skald today. Sign up for whatever you think is appropriate, for whatever SKALD is worth to you, even if it's just a couple bucks a month. Your support is what makes this show possible. Every Tuesday, please talk about and plug SKALD on social media, and make sure to tag me so I can share your posts. I'm Aubrey Sitterson on Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, and Snapchat. You can also hit up aubreysitterson.com for links to everything, including SKALD, my wrestling talk show Straight Shoot, my comics work, bio, contact information, and more. It's been a minute since I plugged some music on SKALD, so that changes now. I give the Dallas, Texas-based Woad my highest recommendation. They are fuzzy, sludgy, stoner doom rock and roll, and they absolutely rip. In fact, lately I've been listening to their newest album, Midnight Cometh, while writing SKALD. Check them out. Thanks for listening. I'll talk at you next week.